You feel overwhelmed by workplace pressures that seem to multiply daily, and every setback shakes your confidence to its core. The stress is affecting your sleep, your health, and your happiness outside of work, while you watch others maintain their composure under similar pressures, leaving you wondering what secret they possess. I am Marcus Aurelius, the emperor who maintained inner peace while ruling the most powerful empire in history, bearing the weight of millions of lives, plagues, wars, and constant political upheaval. The Stoic principles I developed through my personal meditations will give you a fortress of calm that no workplace pressure can penetrate. Using the same philosophy that sustained me through governing an empire during its darkest times, the same wisdom that guided emperors can guide anyone facing modern stress and responsibility. But first, like this video, subscribe for more Stoic wisdom, and comment where you're watching from. I want to see how far this need for inner strength has spread. Let me take you back to the moment everything changed for me. I was 40 years old when the burden of empire fell upon my shoulders, like a purple cloak woven from the threads of destiny itself. One day I was a student of philosophy, content with my books and contemplations, and the next I found myself responsible for the lives of 50 million souls. Scattered across the known world, the weight was immediate and crushing. Every morning I would wake to reports of wars on distant frontiers, plagues ravaging entire provinces, senators plotting in shadowed corridors, and citizens looking to me for answers I wasn't certain I possessed. The marble halls of the palace echoed with the footsteps of messengers bearing news of crises that demanded immediate attention, each one capable of affecting thousands of lives. I remember standing in my private chambers one evening, holding a simple scroll that would become my lifeline through the storms ahead. This was where I began recording my thoughts, my struggles, my attempts to make sense of the chaos that surrounded me. These writings, which I never intended for others to see, became my anchor in a world that seemed determined to drag me into its madness. The pressure was unlike anything you might face in your modern workplace, yet I suspect the feeling is remarkably similar. The constant demand for decisions, the weight of responsibility, the feeling that everyone is watching and judging your every move. The difference was merely in scale. Where you might be responsible for a team or a project, I was responsible for an empire. Where you might face criticism from a boss or colleague, I faced the potential wrath of entire populations. In those early days, I felt myself drowning in the endless stream of obligations. Every morning brought new crises, new demands, new pressures that seemed to multiply like heads of the Hydra. I would find myself lying awake at night, my mind racing through the countless problems that awaited me at dawn. The stress began to manifest in my body, tension in my shoulders, a constant knot in my stomach, a weariness that seemed to seep into my very bones. But it was in those darkest moments that I discovered something profound. The philosophy I had been studying wasn't merely an intellectual exercise, was a practical tool for survival. The Stoic principles I had read about in scrolls suddenly became living, breathing practices that could transform my experience of reality itself. I realized that the empire would survive or fall not based on my emotional state, but on my ability to think clearly and act wisely. The welfare of millions depended not on whether I felt overwhelmed, but on whether I could find the calm center within myself from which right action could emerge. This understanding became the foundation of everything that followed. The recognition that my inner state was the one thing I could control, even when everything else seemed beyond my influence. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Like you, I had to learn that true strength isn't measured by the gold on your finger or the title after your name, but by the fortress you build within your own mind. I traded my ornate imperial rings for simple iron bands, not out of false modesty, but because I needed constant reminders that my worth came from within, not from external symbols of power. My teachers had prepared me for this moment, though I didn't fully understand their lessons until I was drowning in responsibility. Epictetus, that brilliant former slave who became my philosophical anchor, had taught me about the fundamental division that governs all human experience, the things we can control and the things we cannot. But sitting in a classroom discussing philosophy is vastly different from applying it when barbarian tribes are threatening your borders and senators are questioning your every decision. I discovered that most of my suffering came not from the actual problems I faced, but from my resistance to them. When news arrived that Germanic tribes had crossed the Danube, my initial reaction was anger, frustration, even fear. But these emotions served no purpose except to cloud my judgment and drain my energy. The tribes had already crossed. That was a fact I could not change. What I could control was my response to this reality. This became the foundation of what I came to think of as my inner citadellan, impregnable fortress of the mind, that no external circumstance could breach. Just as Rome had physical walls to protect it from invaders, I needed mental walls to protect my peace and clarity from the chaos of daily governance. But unlike physical walls, these inner fortifications made me stronger rather than isolated, clearer rather than defensive. The first stone in this foundation was radical acceptance of reality as it is, not as I wished it to be. When a plague began spreading through the eastern provinces, I could waste energy cursing the gods, lamenting the timing, or spiraling into anxiety about outcomes I couldn't predict. Or I could accept that plagues happen, focus on what could be done, and take appropriate action from a place of calm clarity rather than emotional reactivity. This doesn't mean becoming passive or indifferent. Quite the opposite. When you stop fighting reality, you free up enormous energy for effective action. Instead of spending mental resources on resistance and complaint, you can direct all your attention toward solutions and responses. The plague still needed to be addressed. The Germanic tribes still needed to be dealt with. But now I could approach these challenges as puzzles to be solved, rather than personal attacks on my peace of mind. I learned to see every external pressure as an opportunity to strengthen my inner fortress. Each crisis became a chance to practice non-attachment to outcomes while remaining fully engaged in the process. Each criticism became a chance to examine my own motivations and actions without becoming defensive. Each setback became a chance to demonstrate that my sense of worth wasn't dependent on external success. The irony was profound. The more I detached from needing things to go my way, the more effective I became at actually making them go well. When you're not emotionally invested in outcomes, you can see situations more clearly, make better decisions, and respond more skillfully to whatever arises. Your mind becomes like a clear mountain, undisturbed by the storms on the surface, reflecting reality with perfect accuracy. The most revolutionary discovery of my reign wasn't military or political. It was the realization that we lived not in the world as it is, but in the world as we perceive it to be. I kept a simple crystal lens on my desk, not for magnifying documents, but as a reminder that clarity of vision determines the quality of our experience. Most human suffering comes not from events themselves, but from the stories we tell ourselves about those events. Let me share how this played out in my daily life. When a senator would publicly criticize my policies, my immediate reaction was personal offense. My mind would immediately construct a narrative. He's attacking me. He doesn't respect my authority. This undermines my leadership. What will others think? But these thoughts weren't facts, they were interpretations, and interpretations are always subject to revision with practice. I learned to pause between the event and my response, creating space for a different kind of seeing. The senator's criticism became simply words spoken by a man expressing his opinion about policy. Nothing more, nothing less. He wasn't attacking me personally. He was fulfilling his role as a representative of the people. My authority wasn't undermined unless I chose to be undermined. Others would think whatever they were going to think, regardless of my emotional reaction. This shift in perception changed everything. Instead of wasting energy on defensive reactions, I could actually listen to the criticism for any valuable insights it might contain. Instead of seeing opposition as a threat, I could see it as information about how my policies were being received. Instead of feeling personally attacked, I could remain curious about different perspectives. The key was learning to separate facts from the emotional stories I layered on top of them. A fact is, the senator spoke these words. A story is, the senator is trying to humiliate me. A fact is, the Germanic tribes crossed the border. A story is, this is a disaster that proves I'm a failure as emperor. Once you learn to distinguish between facts and stories, you discover that you have enormous power over your experience of any situation. I developed a practice of examining every upset or anxiety by asking myself, what actually happened, stripped of all interpretation. Usually, the bare facts were far less threatening than the dramatic narratives my mind had constructed around them. A lost battle became simply information about military strategy. A provincial rebellion became data about administrative policies. A personal insult became merely sounds that had emerged from someone's mouth. This doesn't mean denying the real challenges or consequences of events. Losing a battle had genuine strategic implications that needed to be addressed. But those implications could be addressed far more effectively from a place of clear seeing rather than emotional reactivity. When you're not caught up in the drama of your own interpretations, you can perceive situations accurately and respond appropriately. The practice became automatic over time. Whenever I felt my emotional temperature rising, I would pause and ask, what is the objective reality here, separate from my judgments about it? This simple question had the power to instantly diffuse emotional reactions and restore clarity. It was like cleaning the dust from that crystal lens. Suddenly everything became sharp and clear again. You face the same perceptual challenges in your modern world. When your boss criticizes your work, when a colleague takes credit for your idea, when you're passed over for a promotion, these events trigger automatic interpretations that often cause more suffering than the events themselves. The boss's criticism becomes evidence that you're incompetent. The colleague's behavior becomes proof that the world is unfair. Missing the promotion becomes confirmation that you'll never succeed. But what if you could see these situations as clearly as looking through crystal? The criticism becomes feedback about specific aspects of your work. The colleague's behavior becomes information about their character and approach. Missing the promotion becomes data about the decision-making process and criteria. Same events, completely different experience, vastly different outcomes. On my desk sat an empty cup that taught me more about happiness than all the treasures of the imperial treasury combined. Every morning I would look at that simple vessel and remember that contentment comes not from filling our lives with more, but from needing less. The discipline of desire learning to want what happens rather than demanding that what we want must happen became the cornerstone of my unshakable peace. This was perhaps the hardest lesson for someone in my position to learn. As emperor, I had access to anything the known world could provide: the finest foods, the most exquisite art, the most beautiful architecture, the most skilled entertainment. All of it was mine for the asking. Yet I discovered that the more I had, the more I seemed to need. Each fulfilled desire gave birth to new ones, like a hydra of want that could never be satisfied. The breakthrough came when I realized I was approaching happiness backwards. I was trying to change external circumstances to match my internal desires, when the path to peace lay in adjusting my desires to match reality. Instead of asking, how can I get what I want? I learned to ask, How can I want what I already have? This doesn't mean becoming passive or abandoning all ambition. I still worked tirelessly to improve the empire, to create just laws, to protect our borders, and to serve the common good. But I held these goals lightly, as preferences rather than requirements for my happiness. If my efforts succeeded, excellent. If they failed, that was also excellent, because it meant I had more information about what worked and what didn't. The practical application transformed my daily experience completely. When I wanted sunny weather for a military campaign and it rained instead, I could either waste energy being frustrated with reality, or I could accept the rain and find ways to use it to our advantage. Rain made enemy movements more difficult too, and it provided fresh water for our troops. Same weather, completely different experience based on my relationship to desire. I began to see that most of our desires are actually attachments to specific outcomes, and attachments are just another form of resistance to what is. When we're attached to something happening a particular way, we're essentially setting conditions on our own peace and happiness. We're saying, I can only be content if reality conforms to my preferences. But reality has its own agenda, and it rarely consults our preferences before unfolding. The alternative is what I came to call preferential non-attachment. I could prefer that diplomatic negotiations succeed, while simultaneously being completely at peace if they failed. I could hope that a plague would end quickly, while accepting that it might last for years. I could work toward military victory while being equanimous about defeat. This wasn't indifference, it was freedom. The empty cup became my daily reminder that I already had everything I needed for happiness: a functioning mind, the ability to choose my responses, and access to the wisdom of philosophy. Everything else was bonus material, appreciated when present, but not required for contentment. This shift in perspective was like discovering I had been searching the world for something I was carrying in my pocket all along. I noticed that the less I needed external circumstances to be a certain way, the more effective I became at actually influencing them. When you're not desperately attached to outcomes, you can take appropriate action without the desperate energy that often sabotages success. You can negotiate without neediness, lead without grasping, and serve without expecting specific rewards. The discipline extended to my relationship with people as well. I learned to love without possessing, to serve without controlling, to advise without demanding compliance. I could prefer that senators support my policies while being completely at peace with their opposition. I could hope that my wife would share my philosophical interests while accepting that she had her own passions and pursuits. In your modern world, this discipline is perhaps even more crucial. You're bombarded with messages telling you that happiness lies in the next purchase, the next promotion, the next relationship, the next achievement. But I can tell you from experience that the next thing never delivers the lasting satisfaction it promises. The only sustainable source of contentment is learning to be complete exactly as you are, with exactly what you have, in exactly this moment. This doesn't mean settling for less or abandoning your goals. It means pursuing your aims with passionate detachment, giving your best effort while holding the results lightly. It means finding your joy in the process rather than the outcome, in the journey rather than the destination. It means discovering that the empty cup was never empty at all, it was full of space. And space is the most precious thing in the universe. The sword I carried wasn't just a symbol of imperial power. It was a reminder that every action must be guided by virtue rather than impulse. The discipline of action meant learning to respond from my highest self rather than react from my emotional wounds. In the heat of crisis, when senators were shouting, generals were demanding immediate decisions, and the weight of empire pressed down like a mountain, I had to find that still point within myself from which right action could emerge. The 4 cardinal virtues became my compass: wisdom to see clearly, justice to act fairly, courage to do what's right regardless of consequences, and temperance to maintain balance in all things. But these weren't abstract philosophical concepts, they were practical tools for navigating the chaos of daily governance. Every decision, from the smallest administrative detail to declarations of war, had to pass through this filter of virtue. I remember a particular crisis when news arrived that a provincial governor had been embezzling funds meant for grain distribution to the poor. My immediate emotional reaction was rage. How dare he steal from those who had so little? The senators expected swift, harsh punishment as an example to others. The crowd demanded blood. My anger wanted revenge. But virtue demanded something different. Wisdom asked, what would truly serve the situation? Justice asked, what would be fair to all parties involved? Courage asked, what would I do if I weren't afraid of political consequences? Temperance asked, how can I respond with appropriate measure rather than excess? The answers that emerged from these questions were quite different from what my emotions or political pressures suggested. Instead of public execution or exile, I had the governor make full restitution, serve the community he had wronged, and use his administrative skills under supervision to prevent future corruption. This approach served justice better than revenge, protected future victims more effectively than punishment, and demonstrated the kind of leadership that builds rather than merely destroys. The key was learning to pause between stimulus and response, creating space for virtue to operate. When someone criticized my policies, instead of defending my ego, I could ask, what would wisdom say about this feedback? When facing a difficult military decision, instead of acting from fear or pride, I could ask, what would courage guided by justice recommend? When dealing with personal attacks, instead of retaliating, I could ask, how would temperance and wisdom respond? This practice transformed not just my effectiveness as emperor, but my entire experience of leadership. When your actions flow from virtue rather than emotion, you never have to worry about the integrity of your decisions. You might make tactical errors, we all do, but you never have to question whether you acted from your highest self. The discipline also meant accepting full responsibility for my choices without blaming circumstances or other people. It's easy to justify poor decisions by pointing to external pressures, but virtue operates independently of convenience. Whether facing a plague, a war, or political opposition, I always had the choice to respond virtuously or not. The circumstances might limit my options, but they could never limit my character. I learned that right action often requires going against the crowd, disappointing people who expect different behavior, and accepting short-term unpopularity for long-term benefit. When the Stoic path diverged from the politically expedient path, I had to choose virtue over approval. This wasn't always easy, but it was always clear. In your modern workplace, you face the same fundamental choice in every interaction. When a colleague treats you unfairly, you can respond from wounded ego or from wisdom. When your boss makes an unreasonable demand, you can react with passive aggression or respond with courage and clarity. When facing a difficult ethical decision, you can choose convenience or virtue. The beautiful thing about acting from virtue is that it creates its own reward. You never have to worry about maintaining a false image because you're always acting authentically. You never have to remember what lies you've told because you're committed to truth. You never have to question your motives because virtue is self-evident. I kept a simple coin on my desk engraved with a skull, not from morbid fascination, but because death was my greatest teacher in the art of living. Every morning when I saw that reminder of mortality, it stripped away the trivial concerns and revealed what truly mattered. When you know with absolute certainty that your time is limited, every moment becomes precious and every problem finds its proper perspective. The contemplation of death wasn't about becoming gloomy or fatalistic. Quite the opposite. It was about liberation. When you truly accept that you will die, possibly today, you stop wasting energy on things that won't matter in 100 years. The senator's insult becomes insignificant. The administrative error becomes a minor blip. The social embarrassment becomes utterly forgettable. What remains is what has always mattered: how you treat others, how you fulfill your duties, and how you develop your character. I would often reflect on the fact that all the previous emperors, with all their power and wealth and monuments, had returned to dust. Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, all their schemes and accomplishments and failures had been swallowed by time. What did their moment-to-moment anxieties matter now? What did their political victories or defeats ultimately accomplish? This wasn't cause for despair, but for profound clarity about what deserves our attention. Death taught me that everything is temporary, and temporary things should not be the source of lasting disturbance. The crisis that keeps you awake tonight will be forgotten within a year. The promotion you're desperately seeking will eventually be held by someone else. The company you think you can't live without will someday cease to exist. Even the Roman Empire, seemingly eternal and invincible, would one day crumble. Understanding impermanence doesn't make these things meaningless. It makes them properly proportioned. But there was another lesson death taught me that was even more liberating. Since everything ends, including my problems, my suffering, and my mistakes, I could afford to experiment with being truly myself. What was the worst that could happen? Social disapproval, professional setbacks, personal embarrassment. All of these pale in comparison to the fact that we're all going to die anyway. This realization gave me extraordinary freedom to act according to my principles rather than my fears. I began to see each day as a gift that might not be repeated. If this were my last day as emperor, how would I want to spend it? Certainly not worrying about critics or plotting against enemies or accumulating more wealth. I would want to serve well, to treat people kindly, to make decisions that helped rather than harmed. This became my daily practice, living as if each day might be my last. With the urgency and clarity that mortality brings, the meditation on death also revealed the absurdity of many human conflicts. Here we all are, temporary visitors on a tiny planet spinning through infinite space. And we spend our brief time arguing about territory, status, and resources that will outlast us all. It's like passengers on a sinking ship fighting over deck chairs. Once you see it clearly, you can't help but laugh and forgive. Perhaps most importantly, contemplating mortality taught me that the only thing I could truly take with me was my character. My wealth would go to others. My titles would pass to my successors. My body would return to the earth, but the wisdom I gained, the virtue I developed, the love I shared, these seemed to partake of something eternal. This understanding transformed how I approached every decision and interaction in your modern world. You're constantly distracted from this fundamental truth by entertainment, technology, and the illusion that youth lasts forever. But the wisdom remains the same. You will die, probably sooner than you expect, and certainly sooner than you're comfortable considering. This isn't cause for panic, it's cause for awakening. When you remember your mortality, the email that seemed so urgent becomes manageable. The workplace conflict that felt overwhelming becomes solvable. The career setback that appeared devastating becomes educational. The person who annoyed you becomes a fellow traveler deserving of compassion. Death is the great clarifier, burning away everything that doesn't matter and revealing the gold of what does. The skull on that coin wasn't grinning maliciously. It was smiling with the wisdom of someone who had learned that death gives life, its meaning, urgency, its purpose, and love, its poignancy. When you accept mortality fully, you don't become morbid, you become vibrantly, urgently, completely alive. Each dawn found me before a bronze mirror, not to admire my appearance, but to examine my soul before the day's challenges could cloud my vision. The morning reflection became my daily armor, a ritual of preparation that transformed how I met whatever the day might bring. In those quiet moments before the palace stirred to life, I would set my intentions, rehearse my responses, and remind myself of who I was beneath the imperial purple. The practice began simply. I would look at myself in that mirror and ask, what kind of man do I want to be today? Not what kind of emperor, not what kind of politician, not what kind of public figure, but what kind of human being. The answer was always the same: virtuous, patient, kind, just, courageous when necessary, and temperate in all things. Everything else was just the specific context in which these qualities would be tested. Then, I would anticipate the challenges ahead. I knew there would be difficult people to deal with: senators who disagreed with my policies, generals who questioned my strategies, citizens who blamed me for circumstances beyond anyone's control. Instead of hoping these interactions wouldn't happen, I would prepare for them mentally. How would I respond to criticism? With curiosity rather than defensiveness. How would I handle unfair attacks? With understanding that they often came from pain or fear rather than malice. This mental rehearsal was like training for battle, but the battle was with my own impulses rather than external enemies. When the senator actually did criticize my policy later that morning, I wasn't caught off guard by my emotional reaction, because I had already experienced it in imagination and chosen my response. When the general questioned my judgment, I had already practiced responding with openness rather than ego protection. I would also remind myself of the day's priorities from the perspective of virtue rather than urgency. Yes, there were administrative decisions to make, military matters to address, and diplomatic issues to resolve. But the real question was, how could I approach each of these challenges in a way that served the highest good? How could I use each interaction as an opportunity to practice wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance? The morning reflection also included gratitude for what I already had. Before focusing on problems to solve or goals to achieve, I would acknowledge the extraordinary privilege of being alive, of having a sound mind, of being in a position to serve others. This wasn't empty positive thinking. It was recognition of reality. Despite the challenges of imperial rule, I was fundamentally blessed, and starting the day from that awareness changed everything that followed. Perhaps most importantly, I would spend time connecting with the larger perspective that death meditation had taught me. This day was one of a limited number I would have on earth. Whether it brought victory or defeat, praise or criticism, success or failure, it was an irreplaceable opportunity to live according to my highest values. From that cosmic viewpoint, the specific events of the day became much less threatening and much more interesting. I learned to approach each day as an experiment in virtue. What would happen if I responded to every challenge with patience? What would it be like to see every person I encountered as a teacher, offering me a chance to practice some aspect of good character? What if I treated every setback as valuable information rather than personal failure? The day became a laboratory for testing philosophical principles in real-world conditions. The transformation was remarkable. Instead of feeling overwhelmed by the day ahead, I felt curious about it. Instead of hoping for easy problems, I welcomed difficult ones as chances to grow stronger. Instead of dreading certain people or situations, I saw them as opportunities to practice specific virtues. The same external challenges remained, but my relationship to them had fundamentally changed. In your modern world, you likely start your day by checking emails, social media, or news immediately, filling your mind with other people's priorities and external chaos. But what if you began, instead, with that same mirror practice? What kind of person do you want to be today? What challenges are you likely to face? And how do you want to respond to them? What opportunities will you have to practice patience, kindness, courage, or wisdom? The morning reflection doesn't require elaborate rituals or extensive time. Even 5 minutes of intentional preparation can transform your entire day. When you start from clarity about your values and mental rehearsal of your responses, you meet challenges from strength rather than reactivity. You become the conscious author of your experience rather than the victim of circumstance. That bronze mirror reflected back more than my physical appearance. It showed me who I was choosing to become. One day at a time, as the sun set over Rome, I would take out a simple wax tablet and conduct the most important meeting of my day, a brutally honest conversation with myself about how I had lived these precious hours. The evening review became my school of character, where yesterday's mistakes became tomorrow's wisdom and today's small victories were acknowledged and reinforced. This wasn't self-flagellation or narcissistic self-absorption, but practical training in virtue. Just as a general reviews battle strategies to improve future tactics, I examined my responses to the day's challenges to refine my character. The tablet became my record of progress, a running account of the ongoing experiment in becoming fully human. I would begin by asking, where did I act from virtue today, and where did I fall short? When the grain shortage crisis arose, did I respond with patience and wisdom, or did I let frustration cloud my judgment? When the senator interrupted me during the meeting, did I listen with genuine openness, or did my ego immediately go on the defensive? These weren't theoretical questions, they were practical assessments of specific moments when my character was tested. The key was to examine my actions without the emotional charge of either pride or shame. Success and failure were simply data, points in the ongoing process of development. When I handled a situation well, I would note what internal state had enabled that success. When I responded poorly, I would trace the error back to its source, usually some attachment, fear, or false belief that had temporarily clouded my clarity. For instance, I might write, "Today, when the ambassador from Germania delivered his demands, I felt my anger rising and wanted to respond with threats. But I remembered that anger serves the other person's interests, not mine." I paused, breathed, and asked myself what response would best serve peace. The negotiation proceeded much more productively. This wasn't self-congratulation, but analysis of what worked and why. Equally important were the failures. When the messenger brought news of the defeat at the northern frontier, I immediately began blaming the general's strategy rather than seeking to understand what had actually happened. This reaction wasted valuable time and energy that could have been spent on practical response. Tomorrow, I will practice receiving difficult news with curiosity rather than judgment. The evening review also included gratitude for the day's teachers. The difficult senator had given me a chance to practice patience. The crisis had offered an opportunity to develop resilience. The criticism had provided feedback about my policies. Even the day's failures had been instructive, showing me areas where my character still needed strengthening. From this perspective, every experience became valuable rather than simply pleasant or unpleasant. I learned to celebrate small improvements with the same attention I gave to major accomplishments. Progress in virtue happens incrementally, and acknowledging these micro-victories was essential for maintaining motivation. If I had paused before reacting even once during the day, that was worth noting. If I had chosen understanding over judgment in a single interaction, that deserved recognition. The practice also helped me distinguish between what I had actually controlled and what I had merely worried about. Often I discovered that I had spent mental energy on outcomes that were entirely outside my influence, while neglecting the responses that were completely within my power. This awareness helped me redirect my attention to what actually mattered. Perhaps most valuably, the evening review revealed patterns over time. I began to notice that certain situations consistently triggered the same unproductive responses. Criticism from a particular senator always activated my defensiveness. News of military setbacks always led to premature blame. Recognition of these patterns allowed me to prepare specific responses for recurring challenges. The tablet became a record of transformation, showing me not just where I was, but how far I had traveled. On difficult days, when progress seemed impossible, I could look back and see clear evidence of growth. The hot-tempered reactions that had once been automatic were becoming rare exceptions. The patience that had once required enormous effort was becoming more natural in your modern world. You probably end your day by consuming entertainment or scrolling through social media, filling your mind with external stimulation rather than internal reflection. But what if you spent even 10 minutes reviewing your day through the lens of character development? Where did you act from your highest self? Where did fear or ego take over? What did you learn about yourself and others? This practice doesn't require a wax tablet or elaborate journaling. Even mental review while walking or before sleep can be transformative. The key is honest assessment without harsh judgment, celebrating progress while acknowledging areas for growth, and extracting practical wisdom from both successes and failures. The evening review completes the circle that begins with morning reflection. Together, they create a continuous cycle of intention, action, and learning that gradually transforms not just how you handle challenges, but who you become in the process of handling them. The most valuable lesson I learned about difficult people came stamped on my diplomatic seal that even the most challenging individuals believe they are acting from their own version of good. This understanding revolutionized how I handled critics, enemies, and those who seemed determined to make my life miserable. Instead of taking their behavior personally, I began to see it as information about their inner world and their relationship to pain. The senator who constantly opposed my policies wasn't evil or malicious. He genuinely believed his approach would better serve Rome. The general who questioned my military strategies wasn't trying to undermine my authority. He was concerned about the welfare of his troops. The citizen who shouted accusations in the forum wasn't attacking me personally. He was expressing frustration about circumstances that affected his daily life. This shift in perspective changed everything. When you understand that difficult behavior usually stems from fear, pain, or misguided attempts to protect something valuable, you can respond with curiosity rather than defensiveness. Instead of asking, "Why is this person trying to hurt me?" you can ask, "What are they afraid of losing?" or "What pain are they trying to avoid?" These questions open up entirely different possibilities for interaction. I remember a particularly challenging encounter with a provincial governor who had been publicly criticizing my administrative reforms. My advisors wanted me to remove him from office as an example to others. My initial impulse was to defend my policies and point out his errors in judgment, but I chose a different approach. I invited him to explain his concerns privately, genuinely listening for the wisdom hidden within his opposition. What I discovered was that his criticism came from deep love for his province and real concerns about how the reforms would affect the people he served. His resistance wasn't personal, it was protective. Once I understood his underlying motivation, we could work together to modify the implementation in ways that addressed his concerns while preserving the spirit of the reforms. He became one of my most effective allies, but only after I had listened to the wisdom embedded in his opposition. This approach doesn't mean accepting abusive behavior or avoiding necessary confrontations. Sometimes people need clear boundaries, and sometimes their actions require firm responses. But even correction can come from understanding rather than anger, from service rather than ego protection. When you respond to difficult people from virtue rather than reactivity, you often discover that they weren't actually your enemies, They were your teachers in disguise. I learnt that trying to change other people is futile and exhausting. You cannot control how they think, feel, or behave. You can only control your response to their thinking, feeling, and behavior. This realization was enormously liberating. Instead of wasting energy trying to make the senator support my policies, I could focus on explaining them clearly and implementing them effectively. Instead of trying to make the critic like me, I could listen for any valid points and improve my approach accordingly. The practice also revealed that most personal attacks aren't actually personal. The angry citizen shouting in the forum wasn't really angry at Marcus Aurelius, the individual. He was angry at his circumstances and directing that anger toward the most visible symbol of authority. The senator's criticism wasn't about my character, was about policy differences and political positioning. Once you separate the person from the role, most conflicts become much more manageable. Perhaps most importantly, I discovered that difficult people often mirror back our own unresolved issues. The behaviors that triggered the strongest reactions in me were usually the ones I was capable of myself under different circumstances. The senator's arrogance reminded me of my own prideful moments. The general's stubbornness reflected my own resistance to unwelcome feedback. The citizen's anger showed me my own capacity for frustration when things didn't go my way. This understanding transformed criticism from attack into opportunity. When someone pointed out my flaws, instead of defending against the assault on my ego, I could examine whether their observation contained any truth worth considering. When someone challenged my decisions, instead of proving them wrong, I could explore whether their perspective revealed blind spots in my thinking. In your modern workplace, you encounter the same fundamental dynamics. The colleague who takes credit for your ideas isn't necessarily malicious. They might be insecure about their own contributions. The boss who micromanages isn't trying to diminish youth. They might be afraid of losing control or looking bad to their superiors. The client who makes unreasonable demands isn't personally attacking you. They might be under pressure from their own stakeholders. When you can see difficult behavior as information rather than assault, a symptom rather than cause, as protection rather than aggression, you gain enormous power to respond skillfully rather than reactively. You can address the underlying concerns that drive the behavior rather than just the surface manifestations. You can find common ground with people who initially seemed like opponents. The diplomatic seal reminded me daily that every interaction was an opportunity to practice wisdom, patience, and understanding, or especially with those who challenged me most severely. On my desk stood a simple sundial that taught me the most profound truth about human suffering. We live everywhere, except where life actually happens. The shadow moved only across the present moment, yet my mind constantly wandered to past regrets and future anxieties, missing the only time when I had any real power to act, to choose, to live. Learning to anchor my attention in the present became the foundation of unshakable peace. The realization came during one of the most stressful periods of my reign. Barbarian tribes were threatening our northern borders. A plague was spreading through the eastern provinces, and senators were questioning my leadership. My mind was spinning with regrets about past decisions that had led to these crises and fears about future consequences that might destroy the empire. I was living simultaneously in yesterday's mistakes and tomorrow's disasters, while completely missing today's opportunities. That's when I noticed the sundial. The shadow wasn't pointing to yesterday or tomorrow. It was marking this moment, the only moment that actually existed. The barbarians weren't threatening yesterday or tomorrow. They were crossing the border now. The plague wasn't spreading in some theoretical future. It was affecting specific people today. The senators weren't questioning me in the abstract. They were speaking specific words in this present meeting. The shift was immediate and dramatic. Instead of being overwhelmed by the enormity of multiple crises stretching across time, I could focus on the single decision, the one conversation, the specific action that was available to me right now. The barbarian threat became, what should I do in this moment to address the immediate situation? The plague became, what resources can I deploy today to help those who are suffering now? The political challenges became, how should I respond to what this senator is actually saying right now? I discovered that the present moment is the only place where problems can actually be solved. You cannot change what happened yesterday. Exists only in memory. You cannot control what will happen tomorrow. Exists only in imagination. But you can influence what happens right now through your choices, responses, and actions in this moment. All power exists in the present. The practice became a daily discipline. Whenever I felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of imperial responsibilities, I would return my attention to the sundial's lesson. What needs my attention right now? Not the 100 things that might need attention later. Not the 1,000 things I wished I had done differently before. But the one thing that was actually in front of me in this moment. This didn't mean ignoring planning or learning from experience. Strategic thinking and historical analysis remained important parts of governance, but I learned to distinguish between useful reflection and mental time travel. Useful reflection involved extracting lessons from the past to apply in the present. Mental time travel involved reliving old mistakes or rehearsing future disasters in ways that paralyzed current action. The present moment also became my refuge from the emotional storms that could arise around difficult situations. When news arrived of a military defeat, my mind would immediately jump to catastrophic scenarios about the empire's future, or guilty scenarios about my past decisions. But the defeat had already happened, was now a historical fact that I could either respond to skillfully in the present, or suffer about uselessly through mental time travel. I learned that anxiety is always about the future. Depression is always about the past. But peace exists only in the present. When I felt stressed about upcoming diplomatic negotiations, I was living in an imaginary future where those negotiations might go badly. When I felt guilty about a previous policy, decision that had unintended consequences, I was living in an unchangeable past. But when I brought my attention fully to what was happening right now, stress and guilt dissolved, replaced by clarity about what response was most appropriate. The practice also revealed how much of life I had been missing while my mind wandered elsewhere. The taste of my morning meal, the feeling of sunlight on my face during walks in the garden, the expressions on people's faces during conversations of this richness was available only in the present moment. When my attention was scattered across time, I was essentially sleepwalking through the one life I had been given. Perhaps most importantly, I discovered that the present moment was where virtue lived. I couldn't be courageous yesterday or tomorrow. I could only be courageous now. I couldn't practice wisdom in the abstract, could only apply wisdom to this specific situation facing me right now. I couldn't be just in theory, could only act justly in response to the actual circumstances demanding my attention in this moment. In your modern world, you face even more distractions from the present than I did. Technology constantly pulls your attention toward other times and places emails about future deadlines, social media posts about other people's experiences, news about events you cannot influence. But the fundamental truth remains unchanged. Your life is happening now. Your power exists now, and your peace is available now. When you feel overwhelmed by your workload, you can ask, what is the one task that needs my attention right now? When you feel anxious about upcoming challenges, you can ask, what preparation can I do in this moment? When you feel regretful about past mistakes, you can ask, what can I learn from this experience to apply right now? The sundial's shadow kept moving, reminding me that each moment was precious and irreplaceable. But it also showed me that there was always a new moment arriving, always another opportunity to choose presence over mental wandering, always another chance to live where life actually happens. I carried a simple wooden staff, worn smooth by countless hands, that taught me the difference between true wealth and mere accumulation. This modest piece of wood was worth more than all the gold in the imperial treasury, because it represented something that external circumstances could never touch: their understanding that virtue is the only good, and everything else is merely preferred, indifferent. This realization became the unshakable foundation of inner peace. The concept seemed abstract when I first encountered it in my philosophical studies, but life as emperor made it startlingly concrete. I watched wealthy senators lose their fortunes overnight and sink into despair. I saw successful generals suffer devastating defeats and question their entire worth. I observed beautiful courtiers age and mourn the loss of their appearance. I witnessed myself achieving every external goal that society considered valuable: power, wealth, status, influence, and yet finding that none of these brought the lasting satisfaction they promised. The breakthrough came when I realized I had been seeking security in things that were fundamentally insecure. Wealth could be lost to economic upheaval or political changes. Health could be destroyed by disease or accident. Reputation could be damaged by rumors or political shifts. Physical strength would inevitably decline with age. Even the Roman Empire, itself seemingly permanent and invincible, would eventually fall to time and change. But there was one thing that remained completely within my control. Regardless of external circumstances, my character. No barbarian invasion could make me less just. No plague could diminish my capacity for wisdom. No political opposition could reduce my ability to act courageously. No criticism could touch my commitment to temperance. These virtues were mine, as long as I chose to practice them, completely independent of what happened around me. This understanding transformed how I evaluated success and failure. When a military campaign succeeded, I could appreciate the outcome without deriving my sense of worth from it. When a diplomatic initiative failed, I could learn from the experience without questioning my fundamental value as a person. The external results became information about what worked and what didn't, but they said nothing about who I was as a human being. The practical implications were revolutionary. I no longer needed others to approve of my decisions in order to feel good about myself. I only needed to ensure that my decisions flowed from virtue. I no longer needed external circumstances to go my way in order to maintain my peace. I only needed to respond to whatever happened with wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance. I no longer needed to accumulate more possessions or achievements to feel secure. I only needed to continue developing my character. This didn't mean becoming indifferent to outcomes or abandoning all preferences. I still preferred military victories to defeats, diplomatic successes to failures, and prosperity to hardship, but I held these preferences lightly, as matters of convenience rather than necessity for happiness. If my preferred outcomes occurred, excellent. If they didn't, that was also acceptable, because my fundamental well-being didn't depend on them. The wooden staff reminded me daily that the most valuable things in life cannot be bought, stolen, or destroyed by external forces. Integrity cannot be purchased with gold. Wisdom cannot be seized by armies. Courage cannot be stolen by thieves. Compassion cannot be destroyed by critics. These treasures belong to anyone who chooses to develop them, regardless of their circumstances. I began to see that most human suffering comes from confusing preferred indifference with genuine goods. People tie their happiness to things outside their control, other people's opinions, market fluctuations, political developments, natural disasters, and then feel helpless when these external factors don't align with their preferences. But When you understand that virtue is the only true good, you realize that your happiness is always within your reach. This perspective also revealed the futility of envy and the pointlessness of pride. I couldn't feel envious of others' wealth or status because I understood these were merely external circumstances that said nothing about their character or happiness. I couldn't feel prideful about my own achievements because I recognized these were largely the result of circumstances beyond my control. What mattered was how I had chosen to respond to the opportunities and challenges I had been given. The practice extended to how I viewed setbacks and tragedies. When the plague struck the eastern provinces, I didn't see it as evidence that the gods were against me or that I was failing as emperor. It was simply a challenging circumstance that required a virtuous response. When senators criticized my policies, I didn't interpret it as an attack on my worth, but as an opportunity to practice patience and humility while considering their feedback. In your modern world, you're constantly bombarded with messages that equate worth with external achievements, salary levels, job titles, social media followers, material possessions. But these are all preferred indifference. Nice to have, but unnecessary for genuine well-being. Your true security lies in qualities that no economic downturn can touch, no corporate restructuring can eliminate, no technological change can obsolete. When you ground your sense of worth in virtue rather than achievement, you become genuinely unshakable. You can pursue goals enthusiastically while holding results lightly. You can face setbacks without questioning your fundamental value. You can interact with others from strength rather than neediness, since your self-worth doesn't depend on their approval or validation. The wooden staff was humble and unremarkable, but it carried a weight that no amount of gold could match, the weight of truth about what really matters in human life. Above my sleeping chamber hung a map of the heavens, its countless stars serving as a nightly reminder of the vast cosmos in which our small dramas unfold. When the weight of empire threatened to crush my spirit, I would gaze upon that celestial globe and remember that from the perspective of eternity, even the mightiest human concerns are but momentary ripples in an infinite ocean. This cosmic view became my greatest source of both humility and peace. The practice began during a particularly dark period, when multiple crises converged upon the empire simultaneously. Germanic tribes had broken through our northern defenses. Egyptian grain shipments had been disrupted by flooding. Senators were openly questioning my competence, and reports of plague were spreading panic through major cities. The problems felt overwhelming, the criticism felt personal, and the responsibility felt unbearable. That night, instead of lying awake rehearsing disasters, I stepped onto my balcony and looked up at the stars. Those same constellations had shone down upon every emperor before me, upon every human who had ever lived, upon the earth long before humans existed and would continue long after we had vanished. The barbarian invasions that seemed so threatening were invisible from the perspective of those distant suns. The political controversies that consumed so much mental energy were undetectable from the realm of those eternal lights. This wasn't a recipe for indifference or nihilism, but for a profound perspective. The cosmic view didn't make human suffering meaningless, it made it properly proportioned. Yes, people were genuinely hurting from the plague, and that deserved compassionate response. Yes, the empire faced real threats that required intelligent action, but these challenges didn't warrant the emotional devastation I had been inflicting upon myself through catastrophic thinking and ego-driven reactivity. I began to imagine how current events would appear to someone viewing Earth from one of those distant stars. The senator's angry speech would be invisible. The critic's harsh words would be inaudible. The military defeat would be a tiny movement of barely perceptible specks on an insignificant planet. Even the fall of Rome itself would register as a minor fluctuation in the brief experiment of human civilization on one small world among billions. This perspective transformed how I held my responsibilities. I was still fully committed to serving the empire and its people, but I no longer carried the weight of the world as if it all depended on my personal perfection. I was one temporary custodian of something much larger than myself, doing my best with the limited wisdom and power available to me, knowing that the cosmic story would continue regardless of my successes or failures. The practice also revealed the profound interconnectedness of all existence. The iron in my blood had been forged in the heart of dying stars. The oxygen I breathed had been exhaled by countless plants and animals throughout history. The atoms that composed my body had once been part of rocks, trees, oceans, and other human beings. I was not separate from the universe. I was a temporary arrangement of universal elements, briefly conscious and able to participate in the cosmic dance. This understanding dissolved the boundaries that had created so much suffering. The barbarian tribes threatening our borders were made of the same stellar material as Roman citizens. The senators criticizing my policies were animated by the same cosmic energy that moved through me. The plague affecting distant provinces was disrupting the same fundamental life force that sustained my own existence. We were all brief expressions of the same infinite creativity, playing different roles in the same eternal story. From this perspective, conflicts became less personal and more educational. The opposition I faced wasn't evidence of cosmic injustice or personal failure. It was simply the natural result of different perspectives and interests colliding. Within the vast experiment of consciousness exploring itself through countless individual viewpoints, the senator who disagreed with me wasn't my enemy. He was another temporary arrangement of stardust, doing his best to fulfill his role in the cosmic drama. The universal perspective also provided comfort during times of loss and grief. When valued advisors died, when military campaigns failed, when cherished plans collapsed, I could remember that nothing in the physical universe is permanent except change itself. The same forces that had created these people and situations would create new ones. The same energy that had animated what was lost would find new expressions. Death and failure were not endings, but transformations, as natural and necessary as the changing of seasons. Perhaps most importantly, the cosmic view revealed that my true identity transcended the temporary role of emperor. Marcus Aurelius was a brief character I was playing in the universal story, but the consciousness experiencing that character was connected to something far greater and more enduring. This realization freed me from the desperate need to defend and promote the ego identity that felt so important from the narrow perspective of daily life. In your modern world, you can practice the same perspective-shifting technique. When workplace conflicts feel overwhelming, remember that your office building is invisible from the International Space Station. When career setbacks feel devastating, consider that human civilization itself is a recent experiment on a young planet orbiting an ordinary star in an unremarkable galaxy among billions. When personal dramas consume your attention, recall that the elements in your body were created in stellar furnaces billions of years ago and will continue their cosmic journey long after your current concerns have been forgotten. This isn't about minimizing genuine human suffering or avoiding appropriate responsibility. It's about right-sizing problems that have been magnified by ego and anxiety, finding peace in the face of uncertainty, and discovering your connection to something infinitely larger than your temporary troubles. The star map above my bed reminded me nightly that I was both infinitesimally small and cosmically significant, tiny part of an infinite whole. Here, for just a moment, with the extraordinary privilege of conscious participation in the universe's ongoing creation of itself, in my private study sat a bronze crucible that had once been used by metalworkers to transform base elements into precious alloys. I kept it as a reminder that the same process was possible with human emotions, that anger could be transformed into understanding, fear into wisdom, and despair into compassion. This practice of emotional alchemy became one of my most powerful tools for maintaining inner peace while navigating the storms of imperial responsibility. The revelation came during a moment of profound rage. A trusted general had disobeyed direct orders, resulting in unnecessary casualties and a strategic defeat that could have been avoided. My immediate reaction was volcanic anger. How dare he ignore my commands? How could he be so reckless with soldiers' lives? The fury burned through me like molten metal, consuming rational thought and threatening to lead to a response I would regret. But then I remembered the crucible and its lesson about transformation. Instead of suppressing the anger or immediately acting upon it, I chose to examine it as raw material that might be refined into something more valuable. What was this anger really telling me? Beneath the heat, I found concern for the soldiers who had died unnecessarily. Under the rage, I discovered disappointment that someone I trusted had made such a poor decision. At the core, I found genuine care for the welfare of the empire and its people. This deeper layer of emotion was far more useful than the surface anger. Concern for soldiers could motivate better training and clearer communication of strategic objectives. Disappointment in the general could lead to honest conversation about decision-making under pressure. Care for the empire could inspire more effective leadership systems to prevent future tragedies. The same emotional energy that had initially manifested as destructive rage could be transformed into constructive action. The process required patience and skill. Like any form of metallurgy, I had to heat the emotion enough to make it malleable without letting it burn out of control. I had to separate the pure elements from the impurities that served no useful purpose. I had to allow time for the transformation to occur rather than rushing to immediate judgment or action. Fear proved equally transformable when approached with the right technique. When reports arrived of a massive barbarian army massing on our borders than any previous threat, my initial response was paralyzing anxiety about the empire's survival. But when I subjected this fear to the alchemical process, I discovered that it contained valuable information about real dangers that require serious preparation. The fear was pointing toward genuine vulnerabilities in our defenses, weaknesses in our supply lines, and gaps in our intelligence about enemy capabilities. Instead of being paralyzed by anxiety about potential catastrophe, I could use the energy of concern to motivate thorough preparation, strategic thinking, and decisive action. The same emotional intensity that manifested as fear could be refined into the vigilance and determination needed for effective defense. Even grief could be transformed through this process. When my beloved wife Faustina died, the sorrow felt unbearable, threatening to crush my spirit and undermine my ability to govern. But grief, when examined carefully, revealed itself to be love with nowhere to go. The pain was proportional to the depth of connection I had felt. The intensity of loss reflected the richness of what had been shared. This understanding allowed me to honor the grief without being destroyed by it. I could feel the full weight of loss while also celebrating the extraordinary gift of having loved so deeply. The emotional energy of sorrow could be transformed into greater compassion for others who had experienced similar losses, deeper appreciation for remaining relationships, and renewed commitment to living fully while life remained. The practice also worked with more subtle emotions. Frustration with slow administrative processes could be refined into patience and systematic thinking about improvement. Irritation with critics could be transformed into curiosity about different perspectives. Disappointment with setbacks could become resilience and creative problem-solving. The key was learning to pause between the initial emotional reaction and the behavioral response, creating space for the alchemical transformation to occur. This didn't mean denying or suppressing emotions, but rather working with them as valuable raw material that could be refined into wisdom and effective action. I discovered that emotions themselves are neither good nor bad. They're information about our relationship to circumstances. Anger signals that something important to us feels threatened. Fear indicates potential danger requiring attention. Sadness marks the loss of something valued. Joy celebrates alignment with our deepest values. All of these contain intelligence that can guide appropriate response when properly refined. The transformation process also revealed that most emotional suffering comes not from the primary emotion, but from our secondary reactions to it. I might feel initial anger about a situation, then feel guilty about feeling angry, then feel frustrated about feeling guilty, creating layers of unnecessary suffering on top of the original response. The alchemical approach taught me to work with the original emotion directly rather than getting lost in meta-emotional spirals. In your modern workplace, you face the same opportunities for emotional alchemy. When a colleague takes credit for your work, the initial anger can be refined into clearer communication about roles and recognition. When your boss gives you overwhelming deadlines, the fear can be transformed into proactive conversation about priorities and resources. When a project fails despite your best efforts, the disappointment can become learning and resilience for future challenges. The crucible reminded me daily that no emotional experience had to remain in its raw form. Every feeling could be worked with, examined, and refined into something more useful and beautiful. The base metal of reactive emotion could always be transformed into the gold of wise response. The golden laurel crown that symbolized imperial authority was far heavier than its appearance suggested, not because of the metal itself, but because of what it represented, the weight of serving something greater than oneself. True leadership, I learned, isn't about commanding others to follow you, but about becoming the kind of person others naturally want to follow, especially when the pressure threatens to break everyone around you. The most defining test came during the Antonine Plague, when panic was spreading faster than the disease itself. Senators were fleeing Rome, citizens were hoarding supplies, and even my closest advisors were counseling retreat to safer territories. The pressure to abandon the capital was enormous. Rational voices argued that an emperor who died of plague could serve no one. But leadership in crisis isn't about making the easy choice, or even the logical choice. It's about making the choice that serves the highest good, regardless of personal cost. I chose to remain in Rome, not from foolish bravado, but from understanding that leadership is fundamentally about modeling the behavior you want to see in others. If I fled from danger, how could I ask soldiers to stand firm in battle? If I prioritized my own safety over service, how could I expect citizens to make sacrifices for the common good? If I abandoned the city in its darkest hour, what meaning would imperial authority have when the crisis passed? But staying wasn't enough. How I stayed mattered even more. The pressure was immense to appear invulnerable, to project strength through denial or aggression. Instead, I chose radical honesty about the challenges we faced, combined with unshakable commitment to working through them together. I acknowledged the reality of the plague without downplaying its severity. I admitted uncertainty about outcomes, while demonstrating complete certainty about our resolve to respond with wisdom and courage. This approach created what I came to understand as authentic authority leadership, based not on position or power, but on character demonstrated under pressure. People followed me not because they had to, but because they trusted that I would make decisions based on virtue rather than self-interest, that I would share their hardships rather than escape them, and that I would remain steady when everything else was shaking. The key insight was that true leadership is essentially advanced service. The emperor serves the empire, the general serves the army, the administrator serves the citizens. The moment you begin using your position to serve yourself, rather than those entrusted to your care, you lose the moral foundation that makes leadership legitimate. Authority becomes just another form of tyranny when divorced from service. This understanding transformed how I made decisions under pressure. Instead of asking what choice will make me look strong, or what decision will protect my reputation, I learned to ask what response will best serve those depending on my leadership. Often these questions led to very different answers. Looking strong might mean denying problems that needed acknowledgement. Protecting reputation might mean avoiding risks that were necessary for progress. I discovered that people can handle far more truth than leaders typically give them credit for. During the plague, I could have issued reassuring but empty statements about quick recovery and minimal impact. Instead, I chose to share accurate information about the severity of the challenge, while also communicating confidence in our collective ability to respond effectively. This honesty created trust rather than panic, because people could sense they were being treated as partners rather than children. The practice also required learning to remain calm when everyone else was losing their composure. This wasn't about suppressing emotions or pretending to feel differently than I did, but about finding that steady center within myself that could remain stable regardless of external chaos. When advisors were shouting contradictory recommendations, when messengers brought increasingly dire reports, when even trusted friends began questioning fundamental decisions, I had to be the fixed point around which effective response could organize. Perhaps most importantly, I learned that leadership under pressure requires making peace with being misunderstood. In crisis situations, there's rarely time for extensive explanation or consensus building. You must often make unpopular decisions based on information others don't have or perspectives they haven't considered. The test of leadership isn't whether everyone immediately understands your choices, but whether those choices serve the highest good as you understand it in the moment. During the Germanic campaigns, I made strategic decisions that many senators considered overly cautious and many generals considered insufficiently aggressive. Critics accused me of indecision when I was actually practicing careful judgment, of weakness when I was demonstrating restraint. But the test wasn't their approval, it was whether my approach ultimately served the welfare of the empire and its people. This meant developing thick skin without developing a hard heart. I had to remain open to feedback and criticism while not being derailed by it. I had to distinguish between useful advice and emotional reactivity from others. I had to maintain confidence in my judgment while remaining humble enough to change. Of course, when new information warranted it, the golden laurel reminded me daily that authority is a tool for service, not a prize for achievement. Every decision carried the weight of its impact on real people living real lives. Every choice set an example that others would follow. Every response to pressure demonstrated what kind of character lay beneath the imperial purple dot in your modern leadership roles, whether managing a team, running a department, or simply being the person others look to for guidance who face the same fundamental challenges. How do you remain steady when others are panicking? How do you make unpopular decisions that serve the greater good? How do you maintain both strength and humility under pressure? The answer lies in the same principles that guided me through plague, war, and political upheaval. Ground your authority in service rather than ego. Tell the truth even when it's uncomfortable. Remain calm by anchoring yourself in virtue rather than circumstances. And remember that leadership is fundamentally about becoming the kind of person others can trust to put their welfare ahead of your own comfort. In my physician's quarters, I kept a small vial of medicine that became my most profound teacher about hope in the face of overwhelming darkness. The Antonine Plague swept through our empire like a merciless tide, claiming millions of lives and testing every principle I had learned about maintaining inner peace. Yet it was during these years of unimaginable suffering that I discovered the deepest truths about human resilience and the Stoic response to uncontrollable catastrophe. The plague arrived without warning, carried by returning troops from the eastern campaigns. Within months, it had spread to every corner of the empire, killing rich and poor alike with ruthless indifference. The death toll was staggering. Some estimates suggested that a quarter of the population perished. Cities became ghost towns. Trade routes emptied, and the very fabric of civilization seemed to be unraveling before our eyes. The pressure to despair was overwhelming. How could any philosophy, any set of principles, any approach to life remain relevant in the face of such massive, random suffering? What meaning could virtue have when good people died alongside bad ones, when children perished while corrupt officials survived, when all human achievements crumbled before an invisible enemy that recognized no authority? But this was precisely when Stoic principles proved their true value, not as fair-weather philosophy for comfortable times, but as unshakable foundation for the darkest hours of human experience. The plague taught me that we cannot control the external circumstances that befall us, but we can always control our response to those circumstances. Even in the face of mass death and societal collapse, we retain the power to choose courage over cowardice, compassion over selfishness, service over self-preservation. I made the decision to remain in Rome and work personally with physicians, administrators, and aid workers to coordinate relief efforts. This wasn't heroic posturing. It was the logical application of Stoic principles. If virtue is the only true good, then acting virtuously in response to crisis is more important than preserving physical safety. If we cannot control external events, then we must focus entirely on controlling our response to them. The work was heartbreaking beyond description. I watched friends die, saw families destroyed, witnessed the collapse of institutions that had seemed permanent. But I also witnessed extraordinary examples of human dignity under pressure. Physicians who continued treating patients despite knowing they might contract the disease themselves. Citizens who shared scarce food with neighbors. Parents who maintained love and hope even while burying their children. These experiences taught me that suffering, while never welcome, can reveal qualities of character that might otherwise remain hidden. The plague stripped away social pretenses, material distractions, and superficial concerns, exposing what people were truly made of. Some revealed themselves to be cowards and opportunists. Others showed reserves of courage and compassion that inspired everyone around them. I learned to find meaning not in the suffering itself, but in how we choose to respond to suffering. The plague was meaningless, biological event with no moral significance. But our responses to the plague were infinitely meaningful, revealing and developing our character in ways that no comfortable circumstance could achieve. Every act of kindness in the face of horror, every choice of duty over safety, every moment of maintaining hope despite overwhelming evidence for despair, became a victory of human spirit over circumstance. The practice also deepened my understanding of impermanence. The plague reminded me viscerally that everything physical is temporary: bodies, buildings, institutions, even civilizations. But it also revealed that something in human beings transcends physical existence. The love that parents showed for dying children, the courage that physicians demonstrated in the face of contagion, the compassion that strangers extended to each other, these qualities seemed to partake of something eternal and indestructible. Perhaps most importantly, the plague years taught me that hope is not dependent on optimistic circumstances. True hope is the decision to continue acting from virtue regardless of outcomes, to keep serving the common good even when individual efforts seem insignificant, to maintain faith in human dignity even when surrounded by evidence of human fragility. The medicine vial reminded me that healing comes not just from external remedies, but from internal resilience. No amount of medical treatment could cure the plague, but the right attitude could help people maintain their humanity while facing the uncurable. No intervention could prevent all suffering, but wise response could transform suffering into wisdom, loss into compassion, and despair into determination. In your modern world, you may not face literal plagues, but you encounter the same fundamental challenges. How do you maintain hope when surrounded by bad news? How do you continue working for good when progress seems impossible? How do you keep your humanity when systems seem broken and outcomes appear hopeless? How do you find meaning when events feel random and cruel? The answer lies in the same principles that sustained me through the darkest years of imperial history. Focus on what you can control rather than what you cannot. Choose virtue regardless of whether virtue appears to be rewarded. Serve others, even when serving yourself would be easier. Find meaning in your response to circumstances rather than in the circumstances themselves. The plague eventually ended, as all things do. The empire recovered, as human societies always manage to do. But the lessons learned during those dark years remained forever, that our true strength lies not in our ability to prevent suffering, but in our capacity to respond to suffering with dignity, courage, and love. On my desk lay a stone from an ancient bridge that had connected distant parts of the empire, serving as my daily reminder that wisdom must always build connections between past and present, between timeless principles and contemporary challenges. The Stoic philosophy that sustained me through imperial crises 2,000 years ago contains the same practical power to transform how you navigate the pressures of modern life. Whether facing a difficult boss, career uncertainty, or workplace conflicts that test your composure, the fundamental human challenges haven't changed, even though their external forms have evolved dramatically. Where I dealt with barbarian invasions, you face hostile takeovers or industry disruptions. Where I manage senators who questioned my authority, you work with colleagues who undermine your projects or superiors who micromanage your efforts. Where I faced plagues that threatened the empire's stability, you navigate economic downturns that threaten your financial security. But the internal skills required to handle these challenges remain identical. The ability to remain calm under pressure, to respond from virtue rather than react from emotion, to focus on what you can control while accepting what you cannot, and to maintain perspective when immediate circumstances feel overwhelming. These capacities are not dependent on historical period or technological advancement. They are timeless human capabilities, available to anyone willing to develop them. Consider how the morning reflection practice translates directly to your daily routine. Instead of immediately checking emails or social media upon waking, what if you spent 5 minutes setting intentions for how you want to show up during the day? What kind of colleague do you want to be? How do you want to respond? Criticism or pressure? What opportunities will you have to practice patience, courage, or wisdom? This simple practice can transform your entire workday experience. The evening review becomes equally powerful when applied to modern challenges. Rather than collapsing into entertainment after a difficult day, you could spend a few minutes honestly examining your responses to the day's events. Where did you act from your highest self? Where did fear or ego take over? What patterns are you noticing in your reactions? What can you learn to apply tomorrow? This practice turns every experience into education in character development. The discipline of perception offers immediate relief from workplace stress. When your boss criticizes your work, instead of automatically interpreting it as personal attack or evidence of your inadequacy, you can pause and separate facts from stories. The fact is, specific words were spoken about specific aspects of your work. The story might be, My boss thinks I'm incompetent and wants to fire me. By working with facts rather than dramatic interpretations, you can respond more skillfully and suffer less unnecessarily. The discipline of desire becomes crucial. In career management, how much of your workplace stress comes from demanding that circumstances be different than they are? Wishing your boss were more supportive, your colleagues more cooperative, your company more ethical, your industry more stable. This resistance to reality creates enormous suffering while accomplishing nothing positive. Learning to prefer certain outcomes while accepting whatever actually occurs brings immediate peace and often improved effectiveness. Technology presents unique challenges that require Stoic principles for navigation. Social media can trigger constant comparison with others' curated highlights. Email creates pressure for immediate response to every request, and news cycles generate anxiety about events you cannot influence. The ancient practice of focusing on your circle of control becomes essential. You cannot control what others post, but you can control how much time you spend scrolling. You cannot control global events, but you can control how much news consumption you allow to disrupt your peace. The principle that virtue is the only good offers profound freedom from the rat race mentality that dominates modern workplace culture. When you ground your sense of worth in character rather than achievement, you can pursue career goals enthusiastically while holding results lightly. Promotions become nice bonuses rather than requirements for happiness. Salary increases become preferred indifference rather than measures of personal value. Industry recognition becomes pleasant feedback rather than essential validation. Dealing with difficult colleagues becomes an opportunity to practice. The same skills are used with challenging senators, understanding that their behavior usually stems from their own fears or pain rather than malicious intent toward you personally. Responding to criticism with curiosity rather than defensiveness. Setting appropriate boundaries without emotional reactivity. Finding common ground even with people whose approaches differ dramatically from yours. The modern workplace also offers unique opportunities to practice Stoic virtues. Every email is a chance to communicate with clarity and kindness. Every meeting is an opportunity to listen deeply and contribute thoughtfully. Every deadline is a chance to practice excellent work without attachment to external recognition. Every conflict is an invitation to respond with wisdom rather than ego protection. Perhaps most importantly, your daily work becomes a laboratory for character development rather than just a means of earning money. Are you growing in patience, courage, wisdom, and justice through your professional challenges? Are you becoming more resilient, compassionate, and skillful in your responses to pressure? Are you using your position, whatever it is, to serve something larger than your immediate self-interest? The Bridgestone reminded me that the same fundamental wisdom that helped build and maintain an empire can help build and maintain a meaningful life in any era. The external circumstances may change, but the internal challenges and opportunities remain remarkably consistent across time. The choice between virtue and vice, between wisdom and reactivity, between service and selfishness, presents itself daily regardless of whether you're governing provinces or managing projects. You have access to the same philosophical tools that sustained me through plague, war, and political upheaval. The question is whether you'll choose to develop and apply them to transform your own experience of modern challenges into opportunities for growth, service, and unshakable inner peace. In the center of my study burned an eternal flame, tended carefully each day to ensure it never died, representing the enduring nature of wisdom that transcends individual lives and historical periods. As I reflect on the principles that sustained me through the greatest challenges an emperor could face, I am struck by their timeless relevance and their power to transform any life, in any era, for anyone willing to embrace them fully. Why has Stoicism survived for over 2 millennia, while countless other philosophies have faded into historical curiosity, because it addresses the fundamental human condition that remains unchanged despite all external progress. We still face uncertainty about the future, pain from loss and disappointment, anxiety about things beyond our control, and the challenge of maintaining dignity and purpose in the face of adversity. These experiences are universal, and Stoicism offers universal tools for handling them skillfully. The philosophy endures because it works not as abstract theory, but as practical daily guidance for real challenges. Every principle I've shared with you has been tested in the crucible of actual experience, refined through application to the most demanding circumstances imaginable. These aren't ideas I read in books, but tools I forged through necessity and proved through practice. You now possess the same knowledge that guided me through governing an empire during its most turbulent period. The choice before you is simple, but not easy. Will you be a victim of circumstances, or the conscious creator of your response to circumstances? Will you allow external events to determine your inner state, or will you develop the inner citadel that remains unassailable, regardless of what happens around you? The path forward requires no special talents, extraordinary resources, or favorable conditions. It requires only the willingness to take responsibility for your own experience and the discipline to practice these principles consistently. Start where you are, with whatever challenges you're currently facing. Use your present difficulties as training ground for developing the qualities you want to embody. Begin with the foundational insight that transformed everything for me, the recognition that you cannot control external events, but you can always control your response to them. This simple distinction, applied consistently, will revolutionize your relationship to stress, conflict, and uncertainty. Instead of wasting energy fighting reality, you can direct all your attention toward crafting wise, virtuous responses to whatever reality presents. Practice the discipline of perception by questioning your automatic interpretations of events. When something upsets you, ask, what actually happened? Separate from my story about it. When you feel threatened or offended, examine, what facts am I working with, and what dramatic narrative have I added? This practice alone will eliminate enormous amounts of unnecessary suffering. Embrace the discipline of desire by learning to want what happens rather than demanding that what you want must happen. This doesn't mean becoming passive, but rather pursuing your goals with passionate detachment, giving your best effort while holding results lightly. Find your satisfaction in the process rather than the outcome, in the journey rather than the destination. Commit to the discipline of action by responding from virtue rather than reacting from emotion. In every interaction, ask, what would wisdom recommend here? How would courage respond? What would justice require? What would temperance suggest? Let these questions guide your choices rather than immediate impulses or social pressures. Most importantly, remember that this is a practice, not a destination. I didn't master these principles overnight, and you won't either. There will be days when you forget everything and react from ego or fear. There will be moments when the pressure feels too great and the philosophy seems inadequate. This is normal and expected. The key is to return to the practice, to begin again, to treat each setback as information rather than failure. Your life circumstances may be completely different from mine, but your opportunity is identical. To use whatever challenges you face as raw material for developing unshakable character. Whether you're dealing with difficult colleagues or barbarian invasions, financial pressure or political upheaval, family conflicts or international crises, the internal work remains the same. The eternal flame of wisdom burns, not because it's protected from wind and weather, but because it's continuously tended, continuously renewed, continuously passed from one keeper to the next. You have the opportunity to become such a keeper, to embody these principles so fully that they become a light for others, struggling through their own darkness. Imagine what your workplace would be like if you became the person who remained calm in crisis, who responded to criticism with curiosity rather than defensiveness, who treated every interaction as an opportunity to practice virtue. Imagine how your relationships would transform if you approached conflicts with understanding rather than ego protection. If you gave your love freely without demanding specific responses, if you served others without keeping score. Imagine how your inner experience would change if you no longer needed external circumstances to be a certain way for you to be at peace. If you found your security in character rather than achievement. If you drew your worth from virtue rather than validation. This transformation is not only possible, it's inevitable for anyone who commits to the daily practice of Stoic principles. The legacy of Stoicism isn't found in monuments or institutions, but in the quiet transformation of individual lives. One choice at a time, one response at a time, one day at a time. You carry that legacy now. The question isn't whether you have what it takes to embody these principles. You do. The question is whether you will choose to begin. The eternal flame awaits your tending. The inner citadel awaits your construction. The path to unshakable peace lies open before you, marked by the footsteps of countless others who have walked it successfully. The only requirement is the decision to take the first step, and then the next, and then the next, until the way becomes as natural as breathing and as reliable as sunrise. Welcome to the ranks of those who refuse to be victims of circumstance, who choose virtue over convenience, who find their strength and service to something greater than themselves. Welcome to the eternal company of Stoics.